Welcome to today's exclusive interview with Sarah Armstrong-Smith, Microsoft's Chief Security Advisor. We're diving into the findings from the latest Microsoft Digital Defense Report and exploring how Microsoft is setting new standards in cybersecurity with its end-to-end security solutions. As we discuss the evolving cyber threat landscape, Sarah will shed light on how Microsoft applies these powerful tools within its own environment, embracing the role of customer zero. Let's jump in and learn what it really takes to stay resilient in today's digital world. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jane. It's an absolute pleasure as always.
Sarah, over the past year, we've seen significant shifts in the cybersecurity landscape. From the findings in the 2024 Microsoft Digital Defense Report to your broader observations, I'm really curious to understand what key trends have emerged that you believe organizations really need to know about and prioritize.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I think it's worth me taking a moment just to explain what the Digital Defence Report is all about. So, it's our flagship report. It's published every year around October, and it's a look back over that previous 12 months. So, what are we seeing? What are those trends? How are those threat actors are evolving? Now, if I share a few statistics with you, I think everyone likes a few stats just to kind of set the scene a little bit. So, every single day, Microsoft collects and processes over 78 trillion telemetry signals. Now, that is coming off the Microsoft cloud. In essence, anything which is attached to Microsoft. So, it's every single device, every time you log in, every time you authenticate, Microsoft gets a signal. So, how do you make sense of 78 trillion signals? We have over 10,000 people working in cybersecurity. So, these are a mix of analysts, they're data scientists, they're engineers. It's really trying to make sense of all of this data. What are we seeing? So, again, to put that into perspective, Microsoft is tracking about 600 million cyber attacks a day. So, if you're trying to do the math, that's around 220 billion cyber attacks a year impacting Microsoft or our customers. So, if I then dig down and what are we seeing with those 600 million? 350 million of those are identity based attacks. So, identity, when we think about the current trend, is going absolutely off the scale as the primary attack vector. It's overtaken endpoints. And there's a reason why we tell people not to reuse passwords. And this is exactly why, because the threat actors, although they're getting more sophisticated, they're getting more aggressive in some of their tactics, they do still favor the tried and tested. So they're just rotating those passwords over and over and over again. And for them, it's objective number one is getting access. And they don't particularly care how they get access. So I think that's the first thing I'd say, Jane, is really with regards to identity, that shifting dynamic in terms of that initial access. So identity is core to everything. I'm going to come back to that. I mentioned already with regards to the threat actors who are getting more aggressive. So, in terms of the scale of some of those threat actors, so we're actively tracking 1,500 large scale threat actors. So, this time last year it was 300. Now, obviously, there's more than 1,500 threat actors, but I'm talking large scale. I'm talking nation state actors, organized crime, ransomware operators. Of those, 600 are nation state actors. So if we think about the big four, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. So they've got multiple subgroups within them. And I would just sort of say across all of that big four, obviously there are more nation state actors from other countries, but we have seen a marked increase in the level of aggression from some of those threat actors in terms of their willingness to move from not disruption, but destruction. They've also been experimenting with generative AI. And I know we're going to come back to talk a little bit more about AI. But that's a kind of a significant change. And when you think about generative AI, it's only really been around in the last 2 years or so, made famous by ChatGPT. But even in that last year, we've seen a huge spike in multiple different AI applications that are coming online. So you've got open source applications, you've got very niche different applications. But ultimately, this is about them amplifying their attacks with regards to really tailored phishing attacks or really tailored reconnaissance. Yeah, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more as we kind of discuss some of those things. It really has just been a smorgasbord of attacks over the last year.
I mean, we're not joking when we say the cyber threat landscape is exploding. We're not fear mongering at all. I don't believe that we are. And I really think that it's interesting that we're seeing this collaboration between the threat actors, between the nation states and the cyber criminals.
Absolutely. And we're seeing an increase in proxy groups as well. So, what that actually provides is a level of defensibility. So, if you think about, it's a sad fact that we've approaching 3 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have just surpassed 1 year in the war with Hamas in Israel. And the really interesting thing then, if you think about, as I said, the aggression of some of those nation state actors, so if I look at Russia as a prime example, so over the last year, 75% of all cyber attacks that we've seen have been against Ukraine, NATO, and allied forces. Now, if you think about the type of attacks, the destructive attacks that we've seen, particularly aimed at Ukraine and some of those different allied forces. Now, if you did an active cyber attack against another nation, that could be seen as an act of aggression. It could actually have a military level of response. So, in essence, if I want to avoid that escalation, but I also want to avoid the attribution, it's actually better for me as that nation state actor to use these proxy groups, so that organized crime, ransomware operators. And what we have seen is those nation state actors who are actually providing those proxy groups with tools, technology, and know how at a level that they wouldn't necessarily have had access to before. And so, what that really means is if me as the state cannot do an active ransomware attack or I can't do a DDoS attack, but if you're a ransomware operator or an activist, that I'm giving you a green light, in essence, to go and attack the UK, go and attack the US or other allied forces. And that makes it really difficult from two perspectives. One is that attribution, as I said. How do you actually 100% state who is behind that attack? Because again, it's very difficult for you to just state it's Russia or it's China or it's one of those nation state actors. The second thing that makes that very difficult is then from law enforcement's perspective, how do you actually track and apprehend any of these threat actors? And so we're seeing a lot more of this collaboration that's kind of going on between nation state, organized crime, and also other cyber criminals as well. So as we said right at the beginning, Jane, that threat landscape is just getting really complex.
Now, Sarah, when it comes to emerging threats, the report notes a rise in AI driven cyber threats. So, how is Microsoft leveraging AI not only to defend against these threats, but also to predict and prevent attacks before they happen?
Yeah, and I think before we talk about how Microsoft is looking at AI from a defense perspective, I think it's really important, again, just to set the scene with regards to how some of those threat actors are utilizing the power of AI to amplify their attacks. Now, again, if I look at some of those nation state actors, I give you some examples. So we've spoken about Russia already. So we have seen Russia utilizing large language models to do reconnaissance, particularly on satellite imaging. So you're thinking about who's my target, military targets in Ukraine, allied forces, etc. So they're really focusing on looking at that disruption, but also understanding the satellites, the imaging, and how it works. If I then look at Iran, so again, if we think about the fact that Iran are not very well known for their human rights, let's say in their treatment of women. And so, one of the things that we've identified is that they've actually created some websites, feminism websites in essence. And so, they can attract those women to give up some of their credentials and give up their information. So, they're using it for mass reconnaissance and surveillance of their own people. Now, again, think about North Korea and China. They have been very consistent, I'd say, in terms of their favoring their interests. So we look at North Korea. So one of the things that they do is looking at how do they further the regime. So that might be using the large language models again for reconnaissance and who's who when it comes to understanding nuclear or understanding defense. So they've been heavily targeting US, for example. And so one of the things that they're doing is actually utilizing the large language models to refine their spear phishing campaigns. So having identified their target, how do I then make sure that I'm honing that message, that phishing campaign, specific to that individual or that organization? And then if we look at China, so again, China are very clear in terms of furthering their interests when it comes to science, medicine, big tech. So we know that they are potentially stealing intellectual property. So one of the things that they've been utilizing those large language models is actually translations, translations from English into Mandarin, for example, or other languages. Now, if I look at all four of those as well, in essence, that they are thinking about what the nation state actors are typically trying to do. So, as we mentioned already, but maybe stealing intellectual property, performing espionage, learning who's who, or learning and understanding maybe policy, government policy, NGOs, any of those type of things. So, what we do know about nation state actors that's potentially slightly different, maybe from a ransomware operator, is they need to maintain persistence on the network in order for them to be able to extract that intelligence and be able to do something with it. So, as the technology gets better and better at identifying and blocking anomalies, they need to find workarounds. So, they're actually using those large language models to teach themselves about operating systems, to teach themselves about vulnerabilities in those operating systems and how do I exploit those vulnerabilities. And so they're looking at how do I obfuscate what I'm doing? How do I hide in plain sight? So that's part of that amplification of using those large language models. And we've seen that consistently across all of those big four nation state actors, but it's not unique to nation state actors. So just to give you another example, Microsoft has been tracking a large scale organized crime gang in Vietnam. And one of the things that they've done is create 750 million fake Microsoft accounts. So this is a kind of a cybercrime as a service. They sell those accounts to other threat actors who might use that for either collecting credentials, ransomware, and other things. Now, our digital crimes unit is our team of lawyers. So whenever anyone's trying to impersonate Microsoft, so Microsoft is actually one of the most impersonated brands in the world. And so when someone is trying to impersonate us, we do mass takedowns. So we get court orders where we can forcibly take down that infrastructure or we can seize control of that infrastructure. So Microsoft actually got a court order last December to be able to take some of that infrastructure down. Now, the problem is a lot of these threats, like whack-a-mole, they just appear again and they just create more fake domains. So what we have seen in those last sort of 6 months or so, Microsoft actually did another takedown through in July of this year, is that they have evolved their tactics. So we think about maybe a lot of companies that are using multi-factor authentication, they now find a workaround. They might have something like capture, prove to me you're not a robot, prove to me you're not an AI. And so what they're using that AI for is to create human-like signatures. So how do I bypass all of these controls? So I think it's very interesting that whenever we think about those advances in technology, we see those emerging threats. AI is only, the generative AI in particular, has only been around for a couple of years, and so they are refining their tactics. We as defenders then kind of have to think about the countermeasure to that tactic, and they just continue to evolve. So multi-factor authentication, capture, other types of security controls is not a barrier to them. So if I then look at that, what's the flip side of that? So how do we as defenders fight fire with fire, in essence? So, in it, really, what we're trying to do is use the same large language models to actually flip it round. So, if they're trying to obfuscate what they're doing, hide in plain sight, how do we use the large language model to detect that? If they are using advanced linguistics in their spear phishing campaigns, maybe they're refining their language, they're utilizing specific language against a specific individual, to entice them to do whatever needs to be done. How do I use a large language model to detect that linguistics? But I think what's really interesting, if we think about how Microsoft is embedding AI into a multiple of products, you'll be familiar with Copilot. For example, we're embedding Copilot into almost everything. So we have Security Copilot. And this, in essence, is really helping security operations analysts to remove some of the fatigue that we see on that kind of daily basis. So when you're being bombarded with those 600 million, hopefully it's not all 600 million against one company. But what that means is, there's so much coming at us thick and fast. And I think the interesting thing is we talk about this the speed and scale of some of these cyber attacks. So we've seen some ransomware operators who are in and out within 15 minutes. Now, if you think about a lot of security operations, their SLAs are also 15 minutes. So if you're relying on a human to be able to detect, respond, triage, fix it, or move it up the ladder, they're already in and out. So, in essence, what the AI is acting at machine speed. So, how do I automate? How do I block? How do I take offensive action against all of these things that are coming in? So, that's one angle. The other angle then is how do I understand these evolving tactics? So, I mentioned there's from the 1,500 large scale threat actors that we're tracking. How do I know what Russia's up to now? Who's the next threat actor? When we kind of think about how those campaigns are evolving. And again, so that those large language models is giving those people access to real-time information. When we publish a lot of information in our blog, so we might publish indicators of compromise, for example. So in essence, using those large language models to say, where am I most vulnerable in my environment to that particular compromise? Where should I focus my attention? What should I be doing? How should I evolve my tactics? And so that's kind of the proactive and reactive elements, I would say, in terms of really thinking about AI enabled defenses to counteract AI enabled threats.
So, are you finding that the threat actors are tampering with security settings or disabling them so that they can bide themselves time to install malicious tools, exfiltrate data for espionage, extortion, or to launch attacks like ransomware? I'm really curious to know.
So, part of the tactics that they're doing is to understand what security software you're actually running in your estate. So, for example, am I running Microsoft Defender, CrowdStrike, or any other security tool? And so that part of that large language models and the reconnaissance is also about them learning not just operating systems, but learning those security tools. So by them understanding what security software you're running, maybe you're not running any software, maybe you're running multiple software which are actually conflicting with each other. And so what that means is that they can then develop scripts which counteract the technology that has been deployed by that particular company. And so this is about different scripting, it's about automation, it's about different rules. How do I speed up the rules? And so part of that is sitting back, watching, waiting. Have I been detected? If I haven't been detected, I move on. And so I think there's a really interesting thing that we've also identified as well, Jane, in that last sort of year or so. And it's quite interesting when we talk about ransomware. So we have seen a significant increase in the number of ransomware encounters. However, the good news, we have seen a reduction of about a third of successful ransomware. That means going to the full end, actually being able to exfiltrate. So you've got to think about how difficult it is. You need to gain access. You need to laterally move. You need an admin. You need that admin to have the right controls to be able to exfiltrate, encrypt data, whatever the case. And so it's really, really positive news that we can turn around. That when you embrace secure foundations, when you have that extended detection and response to be able to see end to end, irrespective of what technology you're using, and when you're using the power of AI, machine learning, and automation and blocking those threats, it actually makes a tremendous difference. Now, that doesn't mean that those ransomware operators aren't going away and they're going to regroup and think about what's next. But that's why I said they're speeding up their response. And some of those threat actors are foregoing the actual encryption as well. So they're just going straight to the data. And this is why I said it's always about this cat and mouse game. It's in terms of, as we sort of said, that evolving, emerging trend, counteracting it. That means they have to go back and regroup. And I would say one thing, Jane, as well, is the fact that the onus is always on the attacker to evolve first. And that really then comes back to how much persistence, patience, resource, commitment, motivation do you actually have to continue? Now, the large, big ones probably do, the little ones don't. Particularly the opportunists, they're probably going to give up and go somewhere else. So I think there's some really great positive news that we can say. It's not all doom and gloom. There actually are some really positive trends that we can reflect on as well.
Sarah, Microsoft often refers to itself as customer zero when testing new security products and services. Can you explain what exactly this means in practice and how this approach has strengthened Microsoft's own cybersecurity posture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of elements to that, Jane. So I think the first one is Microsoft runs on Microsoft. So all the technology, the tools, even if we're thinking about Office, Windows, Azure, all of those. So Microsoft runs on all of those products. So the security products as well as all Microsoft first party technology. So that being said, the fact that we are customer zero in that relationship means that we have to run faster than all of our customers combined because there's so much dependency on Microsoft. And as we sort of said, we're also one of the most attacked entities in the world. We're also one of the most impersonated entities in the world. And we're really conscious of our relationship in the entire ecosystem. How many companies and organizations are so dependent on Microsoft? So, put that into perspective, we have 1 billion customers that range from single individuals who might be playing on Xbox right through to some of the biggest international customers in the world, including governments and everything else in between. So when you have that level of responsibility and so many entities are so dependent on you delivering those services, resilience, redundancy, reliability becomes absolutely critical. And so we're so invested in terms of what does this mean? I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're evolving some of the thought process around security by design and default. But I just want to kind of go backwards a little step because I think if I talk a little bit about the incident that happened in July with CrowdStrike, and we know that this is not a cyber incident, but what it has highlighted is a kind of the fragility, if you like, of the global supply chain, particularly when we think about software. We think about the dependencies that, as we said, so many organizations have. And so one of the issues, obviously, with the CrowdStrike update was that it went to everybody all at once. And, and so the ripple effect of all of those things combined was huge. Now, part of therefore what Microsoft does is really then thinking about how do we deploy software at scale. So part of that when we talk about customer zero means that all of those software updates, all of those changes we're talking about has to be done on Microsoft first. So when we're deploying updates to Windows or Teams or whatever the case you're seeing, it's Microsoft first. So we can see before it gets anywhere near the public cloud or customers or anything else, we can kind of see and hazard a guess what are the issues, what are the experiences, and so we publish a lot of information about software development lifecycle, about what is good software deployment, and there are some lessons learned with regards to Windows resilience. Now we're working with CrowdStrike and other endpoint security providers with regards to what does that mean going forward, how do we avoid another one of these incidents, because the challenge is we do work in a competitive environment. So we're not just going to turn around and say everybody out of our operating system, nobody's allowed in, because that's not how a competitive environment works and a fair environment works. But the very nature of security tools, as we know, Jane, is the fact that if you're blocking malware, if you need to isolate a machine, you need to be into the operating system. And so, as I say, it's lessons learned with regards to resilience, reliability, and what does that all kind of mean. Now, we look at that at scale, and if I reflect back onto some of the questions that we had earlier about nation state actors and how aggressive they've been. So, if I look back over the last year, 18 months or so, Microsoft has been in the crosshairs of two very large nation state actors from China as well as Russia. And so that's been a wake up call even for Microsoft. So when you think about the size and scale of Microsoft, so if Microsoft can be attacked and can be compromised, what hope is there for everyone else? And so part of that is not last November, we launched our Secure Future Initiative, and it's a multi-year program. And really is a ground up rethink about how we think about security end to end. So a big part is what we've already discussed, which is identity. Identity is core to everything. With regards to that initial access, as we said, in terms of what is priority one for a lot of those threat actors. So identity is really important, but we're also rethinking about how we code operating systems. So a complete design and rebuild about how we think about open source, how we're testing, how we're enabling customers to think about how they're designing and building software. And then it kind of comes to how do we physically engineer our cloud platforms, how are we thinking about networking, micro segmentation. So the huge emphasis is around the technology itself. But I would say a big change from Microsoft is also the culture. And part of that is a directive from our CEO, Satya Nadella, which he's basically said security is number one priority above everything else. And I think this has been almost, I wouldn't say a game changer, but it really has changed the emphasis, I think, for Microsoft and our level of investment. So we have invested 34,000 engineers into this program, which makes it one of the biggest cybersecurity engineering programs in history. And so part of that is that now we have made a few changes. So security is every single person's responsibility in the organization. So we have 220,000 people. And so you might have said, okay, you're a technology company, you've got lots of developers and engineers and people who are working across technology. So you expect them to have a cybersecurity objective and how they're looking at performance and everything. But this goes across everybody. So if you're looking at HR,
And you've got KPIs set against that and have been really leading the way.
yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So from top down, so from executive level right down to the janitor, for example. So everybody contributes in one way or another to the success of cybersecurity. Yes, we've got lots of KPIs. We're measuring all of these things. And I think another change that we've identified is that the organization itself is too big to have a single CISO. And so what we've introduced is deputy CISOs across multiple different areas of Microsoft. So when you think about Azure, we talked about Windows and Office and various things. So each one of those subcategories now has a deputy CISO. And part of their role is to understand that threat landscape, understand the risk, understand the current posture, and kind of embed a lot of these good practices. And I would sort of say is what we're wanting to do as well on top of that, Jane, is share our best practices as well and share our lessons learned, and how we're enabling customers to take advantage of all of these combined. And I think a key question that probably needs to be answered across the industries, it's very easy for us to talk about secure by design, secure by default, but what does that actually mean? What are the things that we actually have to have in play to actually enable secure by design and default? Because it's actually not that easy.
Well, look, this is it. I think about secure design lifecycle, SDLC, as a framework, and that's been around for 2 decades. But you've got to ask yourself, how much has this been adopted? How much have we improved? And I feel really bad saying that, especially as more recently we've got some really good success stories like ransomware, which you mentioned earlier. But just as you said, what exactly does secure by design mean, and how exactly are we doing it? Because it can't be just another marketing term.
Exactly. And I've had some quite interesting conversations with customers who said, okay, this the technology side of things is going to continue to evolve. So whether that's innovations in technology, it's responding to threat actors, it's responding to regulations, that's an ever evolving life cycle, I'd say. But I think they're really interesting is how do you actually change mindsets? So if we're going to sort of turn around and say we need to shift left so that security is thought about every single time, no matter what we do, it's just part and parcel of what we do, it's second nature. How do you actually get people in HR or in marketing and customer services to really think about security? So it's just second nature, and that's the bit they're really interesting. How do you actually change mindsets? It's not all about technology, as we know, Jane. It's so much embedded on the people side of things.
Well, I actually believe that the more technology we have, the more we need to double down on the behavior and the human
Yeah.
side. And I think that's where the behavior scientists really come in and help us to mature as an industry. And really, what I'm talking about is a socio-technical approach that considers both the social and technical aspects of a system, process, or organization, where you can actually recognize that technology and human elements are deeply interconnected and must be designed, implemented, and managed together to achieve optimal outcomes. And I think it gets really interesting for us in cyber because while security falls under technology, it really is a business discipline.
Absolutely. And I think that having that board level understanding of systemic risk is so important. And I think the CrowdStrike incident has been a wake up call as well. Not just because I said it's not a cyber incident; it was a cyber company, but it really just goes to show actually how these interdependencies are. And I remember a conversation that I had with the National Cybersecurity Centre just the following week, and one of the things that we identified, yes, it's not a cyber incident, but it has given threat actors a playbook. So if I want to cause as much disruption as possible, and I want that to have a ripple effect across transportation, logistics, all of those things, I now know what it is I need to do. So I don't necessarily need to focus on how do I go from company A to company B to company C. It's how do I knock out communications? How do I knock out banking? How do I knock out communications at scale? And that's the real change that we need to think about at an industry level to say, how do we protect those things end to end? It's not a simple task, but it's something to think about.
Sarah, Microsoft is a strong advocate of zero trust. Based on the findings in this year's report, how have you seen zero trust evolve? And what are some common barriers organizations face when adopting a zero trust framework?
Yeah, I think if I just set out what zero trust means from Microsoft perspective, it's a set of principles in essence. So the first one is assume compromise. The second one is always verify. And the third one is the principle of least privilege. I think all of those still stand true. And I think if we reflect back maybe a year ago to the last digital defense report, we were really, again, still focused on identity. We were still focused on multi factor authentication. And I think we're still a little bit shocked at how many people have not enabled MFA. MFA just needs to be there by design, I say by design and by default. However, that being said, not all MFA is built the same. And so that's another thing that we have to kind of think about is what does good multi-factor authentication look like in terms of that passwordless authentication, evolving, in terms of having some kind of physical interaction. So if I just give you an example of that, and so we talked about the fact that the threat actors are evolving. So the fact that you have MFA, I'm going to try and bypass MFA one way or another. So we have seen threat actors who are trying to get into the estate, they're trying to mimic an individual. And so they're then trying to enroll their own device. So when you start to see anomalous behavior and you're thinking something's changed in that person's environment in terms of what they're doing, what they're trying to access. And so one of the prompts might be that we then say, okay, I'm going to give you that MFA prompt, in essence, prove to me who you are. And so again, they're bypassing that with, okay, I need to now enroll my own device, or I need to change the device. I need to change the method of authentication. So that's kind of one thing to bear in mind with regards to what they're doing to maintain that persistence on the network. When I said not all MFA is built the same, so if you have a prompt which is simple as it goes to your device, is this you, yes or no? And what we were seeing is push bombing, in essence, which is bombarding the user over and over and over and over again. And so at some point, you're just going to get so fed up, you're going to, yes, it's me. Now, the interesting thing that Microsoft identified is actually 99% of people, when they receive that request, don't even have to be bombarded. They just do it at the first time. So, yes, even though they're already on the network, so it can be sometimes it's that easy for people to just for threat actors to bypass an MFA prompt because they're literally the person's just going yes. So how we've evolved that thinking, in essence, is you may be familiar with the Authenticator app, which is part of Microsoft's sort of MFA technology, if you like. So that kind of does one of two things. So yes, you're still using your device, but you get a prompt. And in essence, it's asking you to match a number that's on your screen. So, first of all, it makes you stop and think. So, you have to kind of think about, there's a number. And I have to then think, am I actually logged in right now? And what is the number on the screen? So, the second thing it does, which I think is very useful, it actually tells you where the login is coming from. So maybe it actually is you. Maybe something has changed, and there is in your environment, and you are getting a prompt, but it's actually going, oh yeah, I can see it's my house that I'm logging in from. Maybe I'm logging in from a different device or a different network or something like that. But if I'm getting a prompt that says I'm logging in from India, probably isn't me. It's probably if I'm working in the UK or something, something's probably a little bit amiss. So what we're trying to do is give people more information for them to not just stop and think, but actually sort of challenge themselves a little bit with regards to where's this prompt coming from? Is it legitimate? So it is going to continue to evolve. They are going to find workarounds, but I would say that one of those big issues is really with regards to about that MFA. So MFA is really important, but it has to be MFA in the right way. The second thing, which I know that we talk about so often, Jane, is passwords. And so weak passwords, reusing passwords, just kind of over and over and over again. I don't know how many times we say the same thing, but this is the challenge. And as we said already, it's the fact that they will just pick up one, they just rotate them over and over because they know at some point this is going to open a door. And I don't know what door it necessarily. I don't know if it's interesting to me. And so if it's not interesting to me, I'll just sell it to somebody else on the dark web and they will use it. But it's a real wake up call that as an industry, we need to rethink about passwords and go passwordless. And if I know that's not an easy thing for a lot of individuals and companies, but again, we have to think about then if you can't get rid of a password, can you use a passphrase instead? Something that's not easy to remember because you're bound to use your favorite football team, your pet's name, or whoever else. Easy to remember. I can go to your social media account and get all of that. But if it's a phrase from your favorite song or a film or something, that's probably not an easy thing for them to guess, but it's easy for you to remember. And then we talk about use of password managers and things like that. So it's a constant reinforcement, I'd say, Jane, of the secure foundations.
And it's difficult because whilst everything is hackable, you've got to stop and think about whether or not you want to use a password manager. Because we've had instances in the past where these companies have been compromised. So I appreciate that it really is difficult. And I totally agree with you, Sarah, when you say, in terms of MFAs and passwords, we need these to evolve and we need better ways because certainly in terms of passwords, they've not worked effectively for years.
I think The other point on that one as well, Jane, is the fact that, as we already touched on, is that the threat actors are getting much, much better at social engineering. The phishing emails are perfect. They're using the AI to refine the language and to do all these things. So, expecting somebody to be able to identify a phishing email when it is a direct replica of the real thing, telling people not to click links in a digital world when every other thing that they're supposed to click is a link is counterintuitive. And so the technology has to act as a safety net, in essence. We have to assume, for the best will in the world, the technology, the training, the awareness, blah, blah, blah. People are going to click links because that's what they do. The threat actors are going to refine the phishing emails to manipulate people to do whatever they need to do because that's their job. And so part of that then is, how do we assume that compromise? So how do we make sure that the technology is working in the background to identify that this link is taking you to a fake domain? The URL doesn't look right. This is probably going to start downloading malware. So I need to put that in a safe environment. I need to sandbox it. I need to kind of do all these things that assumes that those actions are going to take place. And I think that's where we kind of need to not rely on the human, to be able to know all these things and counteract all these things, but actually make sure the technology is working for them in the background. And part of that is a assume compromise mentality.
Assume compromise and trust no one. If we can raise awareness and get people to think in this manner, improving their cognitive security and cyber literacy along the way, then we are going to obviously do a better job. When I'm talking about people, I'm even thinking about children, because this type of mindset needs to be taught in schools and at home, because security isn't just for work, it's a way of life. And yes, we do need to have secure by design products that are secure by default, so we're not having to operate in this manner. But until we do have this, we must change our mindsets and approach this that way.
I think that's a great point you make there, Jane, as well on the children. And there's a long time where it was all stranger danger, but actually you need to be aware of people who are trusted individuals, people who are impersonating your teacher, your friends, or even your family member, because that's what the threat actors are doing. They're building trust with you so that they can manipulate you. And I think that's an important mindset to carry through in terms of how we're teaching people, with regards to, this is probably somebody you do know, particularly when we talk about romance scams and some of those type of things, is their whole game plan is to build the trust so that you do then take it to the next level and do whatever they need you to do.
Sarah, with Microsoft handling vast amounts of threat data globally, how do you ensure that insights from this data are actionable for customers across industries? And what role does data sharing play in enhancing collective security?
I think the last couple of years, Jane, have been an absolute game changer when it comes to active data sharing and collaboration. So, if I just put that into perspective with regards to the war in Ukraine, so one of the decisions that Microsoft made early on was not just sharing intelligence with other intelligence agencies and governments. We said, ultimately, if you need to make decisions about where's your data or where you're putting your business, do I need to change my business model? I need to put that into the hands of people that actually need to make those decisions, organizations. And so if that knowledge and know-how is only held by governments or only held by intelligence agencies, how are they making those informed decisions? How are the boards understanding that systemic risk that we just talked about? And how are they investing in cybersecurity if they don't know any of these things that are happening? So, in essence, as we said, we made that decision and we are encouraging people and organizations and big tech to be really open and transparent. And I really think that's a game changer, not just in terms of sharing that intelligence, but also when you've been the victim of a cyber attack. I think historically there's been a stigma, whether that's from the media or how people or even organizations are treated. It's their fault, in essence, that because you're weak, you don't have good security and whatever. But as we said, Jane, the threat actors are invested in doing this. So they're improving their technology, their resources, and everything else that goes with it. So we need to stop looking at what the organization did wrong and look at what the attacker did right. And therefore, what do we learn from this? How do we be more transparent? How do we make sure that we're kind of coming together as a collective? And I can kind of say, in a roundabout way, that has had the desired effect by the fact that Microsoft has become a prime target for some of these nation state actors, because they want to know what we know about them. How are you tracking it? How are you able to attribute? How are you getting this information? And so part of that obviously is the role that big tech plays in disrupting some of the kind of intelligence gathering and sharing and everything else. And even after SolarWinds, there was an executive order that came from the White House that said, actually, we do need more public private sector collaboration, but big tech has a huge role to play in that as well. So we're, as I said, we're very conscious of the role that we play in terms of the intelligence that we hold, the sharing of that intelligence. But it's a fine line between not giving too much intelligence away that gives the threat actor the upper hand, but giving enough intelligence so that people and organizations can make informed decisions. So, as part of sharing that wider, we embed a lot of that intelligence into our security products. So, we've talked about automatically blocking threats, and sharing that information publicly as well at the same point. But it's also then thinking about, what does that future look like? What should we be investing in and innovating, and how we should be thinking about some of those technologies. So we mentioned AI, quantum is another kind of key area. But I think it's so important. And kind of the final point I would make on that as well is, what we're really trying to encourage as well, Jane, is that anybody can come to Microsoft with a vulnerability that they've identified in any part of our operating system. So that's Windows, it's Azure, it's Office, it's anything really. And so, what we want to be able to do is offer bug bounties. So, in essence, we pay you for, and that kind of goes up on a sliding scale. So, people can make quite a lot of money actually by coming to Microsoft, enabling us to build those patches and deploy the patches. But again, we want to be transparent, because it's really good kudos for those security researchers to be able to say, I found this vulnerability, this is how I've done it, this is what we're doing. Because ultimately, the worst thing, if someone sells that to the highest bidder on the dark web, we don't know about it, and then it's open season for threat actors. So part of that secure future initiative as well is being wanting to say to other software providers that you also, please be transparent, please offer these kind of bug bounty programs. They're so valuable to the industry to kind of share this knowledge and know-how and everything else. But we're actually increasing the bug bounties as well, particularly when it comes to that innovative and emerging technology in AI, because a lot of it is so new. We don't know what we don't know at this point. And so we kind of need people to kind of figure it out, because if we're not figuring out, the threat actors are going to figure out, because of the resource, the technology, and the motivation behind it. So I would sort of say it's incumbent on all of us to really come together. So we're very mindful of the role that Microsoft plays in that ecosystem, but I think it's incumbent on all of us, I think, to have that openness and transparency and trust, and really think about how we talk about security, and how we share those lessons learned collectively.
Yep, building on that, I'd say innovation and creativity are absolutely essential. And bug bounty programs are a fantastic example of how they can be leveraged to strengthen cybersecurity. Now, another critical piece, I believe, is diversity, not just because it helps us avoid blind spots, but also because it drives better innovation and problem solving. And I'd also add that collaboration is really important, because sharing and working together can significantly enhance our ability to defend our environments effectively. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing such valuable insights today. From the findings in the Microsoft Digital Defense Report to how Microsoft is leading by example as customer zero, it is absolutely clear that staying ahead in cybersecurity takes not just advanced tools, but a proactive end-to-end approach that Microsoft embodies so well. For everyone watching, we hope you found these insights as impactful as we did. If you're interested in learning more, be sure to check out the full Microsoft Digital Defense Report and explore their solutions to see how they could work for you. Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep evolving your defenses. Until next time, bye for now.